Well, good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time. Happy Valentine's Day. Today is February 14th, but interestingly enough, we're not going to be talking about St. Valentine today because it's actually the memorial of St. Cyril and St. Methodius, who each lived around 850. Now, they are the patron saints of Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, along with ecumenism in the church. And ecumenism is just a fancy way of saying unity between the East and the West and the various denominations, which is something that we need to pray for all the time, that the church would be more ecumenical, more accepting of the different ways that God is expressing himself in different communities. Well, I like this memorial because I think it's cool when I find two brothers that have gone into ministry together. It kind of reminds me of John and Charles Wesley. So here on the left, you see St. Cyril and St. Methodius, who were brothers that went into missions together. And on the right, you see John and Charles Wesley, who were instrumental in founding the United Methodist Church. And, kind of like myself and my brother Andy, who were both called into ministry, this story of St. Cyril and St. Methodius kind of reminded me of our story, because while each of these brothers had his own unique calling, for a time they were able to work together. But then one of the brothers passed prematurely. And so it reminded me of my story with my brother, because we had the opportunity to work together in ministry, and then he passed prematurely. Well, these were Greek brothers from Thessalonica, and both were called into missions. Yet St. Cyril, he kind of had a monastic vocation, so he ended up taking the name Constantine, while his brother Methodius was called into the priestly vocation and eventually actually became the bishop to the Slavic people. Now, the interesting thing about these two is that they served in the church during a time when the Duke of Moravia was kind of looking for political independence from the Eastern Emperor. Now, miraculously, that request for independence was granted, and it's not very often that we see anyone in power in any age give up any kind of power, but this happened. And so St. Cyril and St. Methodius, they went out and they were helping establish this ecclesiastical autonomy for this new place. Now, they also, in the process of doing this, though, they had to invent their own alphabet for liturgy, and then they had to kind of put it into liturgy. And so what we see here is the Glagolitic script, or the Slavonic, what was used for the Slavonic liturgy. And I think this is really interesting and very complex looking to me. And it's interesting to note that the liturgy that they invented along with this alphabet was actually approved by Pope Adrian II. I mean, there was a strong desire to reach these people with the gospel of Christ, and St. Cyril had developed much of this Slavonic liturgy. But here's something mind-boggling. His brother St. Methodius was said to have translated the entire Bible into Slavonic within 8 months. Now, I can't imagine translating one book of the Bible into any language in 8 months, not to mention the whole Bible. So, while we're not focusing on St. Valentine today, I think both of these saints have demonstrated a clear and sacrificial love for Christ and for the work of the church. Not many people could even think about answering a vocational call to missions that required the invention of an entire alphabet and liturgy and an entire translation of the Bible to be put together. So what a strong comprehension of God's call these brothers had to engage in such a monumental undertaking. And I think it brings into focus just how much grace God gives us when we follow him. Missionary Brian Scott, who was a friend of my brother's, and missionary Brian Scott is a missionary to Honduras, and I was able to go over there, spend some time with him in Honduras. But one of the things he told me, he says, if God calls you to something, because I was asking him how he was faring with this mission way in Honduras, he says, if God calls you to something, he's going to anoint you and equip you for that. And that's why it's so important, I think, to listen and be receptive and to answer God's call in our life, because God might be calling us to something and we just need to hear that and then trust He's going to be with us. And that kind of reminds me of our Old Testament reading for today from the USCCB, right? Where God is talking to Noah, and He basically says, Noah, a flood's coming. You need to start building a massive boat and prepare to house pairs of every kind of animals on this boat. I mean, this had to be a massive and a very intimidating undertaking for Noah. I mean, imagine the work involved just in getting the wood alone, and preparing that wood and cutting it into, usable pieces and treating it and all this stuff, not to mention the engineering and the flood and the food reserves for the animals and all this stuff. Yet, even with such a huge task before him, look at how the Bible tells us that Noah responded to this call of God. And we see this here in Genesis 7:5 and 7:10, where we read this: Noah did just as the Lord had commanded him. As soon as the 7 days were over, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. And so the last thing I want to mention here is, imagine if Noah wouldn't have answered that call to take on that huge task of building the ark, and then those floodwaters came. I'm sure that he would have been kicking himself, and who knows where we would all be, right? But what's the application for the journey today? I think it's this: sometimes a new work can be intimidating and complex, but if this is a work that God is truly calling us to undertake, He will supply the grace and the means to get His work done. So like Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius and like Noah, let's just listen to God and then walk in faith, and let's see what God does. Well, I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time. Have a happy Valentine's Day.